What a mess. That is the only way I can actually describe this game. When I started, I expected Gears of War 5 to be way better than I had been led to believe in the past, simply due to how much better Gears 4 was, at least to me, than one would have you believe. So Gears of War 5 must have been a lot better too, right? Well, it's complicated. Unlike my previous retrospectives, where I would go through the marketing, the development, the story, and then the reception of the game to really break down how everything came together and really tell as much of the story behind the game as I could find, this time around I feel as though it would be hard to really nail down the issues of the game and its creation if we don't first talk about the game itself and then go from there. Gears 5 launched on the 6th of September 2019. Published by Microsoft and developed by the Coalition, the game was off to an impressive start, with 3 million units sold within the first week, rivaling Halo 4. Reviews by critics were generally favorable, being happy with just about everything except for the story and lack of innovation with the game's systems. And that is kind of the entire problem with the game. See, when it comes to the PvP and co-op modes, nothing really but the gameplay matters, so the story and lack of innovation there isn't too big of an issue. But the main thing that makes these games so memorable is the story. And that one just did not deliver, which is really confusing as the game, at times, manages to show its excellent storytelling. But let me back up for a moment. So, to refresh your memory, or for those who may have never played Gears 5, the story picks up just about immediately after the end of Gears of War 4. Realizing that shit well and truly is fucked, Minister Jin buries the Lancer and aids the newly reformed Delta Squad consisting of Marcus, Kate, Del, and JD in defending against the oncoming swarm threat. However, in true Phoenix fashion, Delta does their own thing and attempt to reactivate the Hammer of Dawn satellites. Launching one of them, they head back only to find out that they still cannot reactivate the Hammer array due to a lack of connecting satellites. Having been found out by Jin, the team is ordered to cease the reactivation of the Hammers. Before the discussion goes any further, however, Delta is sent to aid Settlement 2, which is currently under swarm attack. Deploying with a former squad mate, Faz, aka Dickhead, and the first half of Baird's replacement, Del and Kate find out that JD once ordered his squad to shoot civilians, which causes the relationship between the new trio to fracture, and finally giving us a reason as to why JD went outsider in the first place. Yet again, before the discussion can go any further, the swarm invasion intensifies, and JD orders the one hammer that they recovered to strike, despite repeated attempts by Baird to tell him that this will go wrong. Lo and behold, things go wrong, and we sadly have to add yet another Carmine to the tally alongside JD's hairline and right arm, blasting right past any and all character development that JD may have gone through. We fast forward 4 months to Kate trying to recruit a camp of outsiders led by her uncle. Here, after yet another swarm incursion, Kate somehow takes control of swarm units and kills her uncle right before JD and Faz come in to drive off the remaining enemy forces. Trying to uncover how she's connected to the swarm, Kate leaves to find answers and eventually finds them in a secret lab underneath Mount Kadar. Here they find Niles, the New Hope AI from Gears 2, as an AI construct who conveniently exposition dumps all the info about the origin of the Locust to us to explain in no uncertain terms that Kate is going to be the next queen of the Locust. Well, the Swarm. Demanding he severs her connection to the Swarm, Kate learns that her mother is somehow still technically alive through a connection made via the Matriarch, the first Berserker to have ever been created. Realizing that Niles is trying to use Kate somehow, they cut the connection and try to hunt him down. Clanker being a clanker, Niles fights dirty and unleashes Deep Frozen Locust. You know, the one species that was canonically eradicated at the end of the third game, and the remainders hunted down in the books. Yeah, somehow the Locusts have returned, cause that makes any sense. Fighting your way through these, you finally get to Niles, only to have him killed by the Matriarch, which you then quickly dispatch as well. Now knowing of the looming threat, Kate wants to reactivate more hammers to prepare for what is coming and heads to Vesgar, a previously UIR occupied region which still seemed to hold intact Hammer of Dawn satellites, which they decide to launch due to being told that the swarm has become more organized than ever before. Fending off the Eurosaur Riftworm, the team manages to launch the satellites and return to New Ephira and try to figure out where the swarm may have its main hive, right at the same time as when the swarm decided to launch an attack on the city, with the new queen fully revealing herself and forcing you to decide whether JD lives or Del dies. Because, let's be honest, Del was such a lackluster character, you didn't even notice I stopped mentioning him past the beginning of this recap. Having killed off the second half of Baird's replacement, the remaining team members fend off the swarm invasion with the help of the Hammer of Dawn and end the game by essentially charring New Ephira. So now that we have a general base, let's get into the issues that stem from the story itself, as this aspect was the most brought up issue among everyone who reviewed the game, alongside how samey it felt, even though there have been major changes introduced into the campaign, such as the semi-open world. Hey, Hawks from the future here. I just wanted to make sure one thing still came across. This is a fun game. I enjoyed my time playing it a lot. And if it had been, a standalone game, I think this would have been an amazing experience, but it is not a standalone game, and thus it sadly has to be compared to its predecessors. In what follows, I will sound very negative, so I wanted to make sure I make it clear before we continue. This is a fun game, and I do believe it is actually worth your time if you can look past the flaws in the story. Alright, back to the video. And why don't we start with that? A semi-open world was said to ruin the pacing of the story time and time again, given the stakes established by providing an empty, flat, and mostly uninteresting world that only rarely managed to break up the monotony via miniature combat scenarios, which essentially only existed to make the jack grind even the slightest bit exciting. If the game didn't decide to disconnect you in the middle of a play session due to it being a live service game, or if the skiff didn't randomly become inaccessible because it decided to clip through the ground. Mind you, this game was released in 2019, at the absolute height of the live service game spam. One would have expected they would learn from the mistakes of their competitors and, work on the connection, or at the very least the geo of the entire map. Now, the open world aspect really didn't help the game, and it felt as if the open world was something that was being enforced by Microsoft management due to the trends at the time, instead of being a decision that was made by TC themselves. But we know that to not be true. This decision was explicitly made by the coalition to, and I quote, make the series their own, end quote, after having tried to prove themselves by attempting to show that they could make a proper Gears of War game with Gears of War 4, a task that I believe they actually succeeded at. However, by trying to make the series their own, they actually managed to dilute the entire experience, despite saying that the introduction of the skiff, Jack's upgrades, and the semi-open world were there to push the series forward. Not only were people already saturated with live services, but better, more polished ones at that. Ones that didn't stall the game with empty yawning spaces. How these aspects were meant to, quote, push the game forward, instead of taking away from the much more intricate urban settings, on-the-rails linear corridors, and tighter writing that the series is known for, I cannot imagine. It didn't really heighten the game by any notable degree either. And sadly, the same goes for the story of the game. It is actually insulting how many times the story had a great setup to get us to know these characters more, only for these opportunities to be shut down as hard as Concord was. Remember how in the last game, the main complaint was that the story was too slow? It seems as though the writers overcompensated this time around, skipping over entire story arcs and hand-waving explanations for the sake of brevity. As mentioned before, JD, post-Baldening, just does not get character development at all. Any and all changes were just off screen for some reason, removing the opportunity to get to know a character the audience was already invested in more. We aren't even allowed to see how these events changed him, and just swap to a different character due to the team deciding that watching someone go through something wouldn't be as impactful as going through it yourself, which would be a good point if it wasn't for the fact that they did that to JD himself, and that Kate's entire arc ends extremely early into the game with the death of the matriarch. That's just exceptionally baffling given how the marketing was centered around Kate, with 3 trailers that showed her trying to understand and overcome her connection to the swarm, and Kate Diaz themed vans. They even made shoes meant to be inspired by her, only to kick her plot to the curb. This is insane! The new psychological aspect that was introduced by these trailers and that the game wanted to focus on is just unceremoniously removed, and the plot goes back to external struggles, almost as if the writers didn't know where to go with it. You put her on vans, you can't just back out like that! The connection to the swarm that Kate had could have been used for some great storytelling, or at the very least, some cool gimmick missions in which you maybe tried to collect some info on the swarm while trying not to act sus as a swarm unit controlled by Kate, or exploring Kate's psyche more. But instead, this entire idea was just seemingly there to kill off Oscar, which didn't even impact the story that much. But at the same time, it got rid of Oscar, which I personally am a fan of because god, he just sucked in the last game. But just like most other ideas in the game, he felt like he could have had potential. Potential as a faction leader opposed to both the Swarm and the Cog. But his death didn't even change Kate in any way. She didn't get more reckless or anything. If anything, it felt like even the writing team forgot about Oscar a mission or two after. Kate being the next queen in line, a plot thread that was set up throughout Gears 4 as well as Acts 1 and 2 of Gears 5, gets abruptly cut short thanks to Niles' exposition dumping and then dying immediately. It is such a baffling decision. His return felt completely unnecessary. He was just there to explain how Kate was connected to everything, in not even an interesting way. He just dumped it all at once. I can't believe they actually thought that was the right way to handle it. But whatever. What is not whatever is the lore-breaking retcon of there still being Locust. As mentioned in my prior video, the blue wave of doom that was meant to tie off all loose ends was meant to tie off all loose ends. You cannot say that some Locusts still get to exist just because they're frozen. If there was a reason for that in the books, reiterate it in the game. Not everyone reads the books. I haven't even once heard of a single thing about the Locusts still existing past the picking off of survivors in one of the books. And even then, why are they still Locusts? Gears of War 4 established that the previously killed Locust actually just got cocooned. Why were these Locusts not cocooned? Rather than actually contributing meaningfully to the story, like the revisit to Azura in the beginning of the story, this just felt like nostalgia bait. Gears of War 5, in general, was really just a huge amount of nostalgia bait. It didn't feel like the references to older games were placed there to enhance the story in any way, but instead simply to get people to do the Wojak pointing meme whenever something from the old games was mentioned or brought up. This was most blatant, with the Locust just somehow returning, even though they should have been Sludge and Paddock, who was from Gears Judgment and was hinted at to be an old friend of Baird's, but again, no effort was made to acquaint him with a new audience. It makes sense not to do that when the characters have been a series mainstay, like Marcus, Cole, or Baird, because reintroducing the characters constantly would be stupid. But Paddock was from a spin-off game, one that was not well regarded at all. These issues, among quite a few others, however, are issues that would remain contained within Gears 5 and wouldn't have carried over to Gears 6. You know what would have carried over? The decision you made of who lived and died at the end. Not only did that decision feel like a vain attempt to recapture the emotional weight of Dom's death, but it isn't even set up in such a way that it could reach the emotional highs of that moment. The choice between JD and Del felt shoved in? Like, JD has an actually interesting character that has evolved since his introduction. Meanwhile, Del just remained the nerdy, smart, jokey friend stereotype. Even Faz. fucking Faz had more character development than Del. He was more interesting to keep around than Del because for some reason the coalition decided to split the character of Baird into two characters, but only gave one of them an iota of the character arc that Baird went on. So with one of them now dead, what happens in future games? Will the team write entirely separate narratives to accommodate the choice? Which would be genuinely impressive. Maybe they will only change the dialogue that is spoken in the next game, completely removing any agency the characters could have, as they cannot be allowed to do anything that the other character would have done, as that would be out of character. Or will they just decide on one canon going forward, completely voiding the impact of the choice? They kind of just wrote themselves into a corner with that one, and I don't know how they would get out of that without leaving at least some of the players miffed that their choice was disregarded in some way. You might say that this isn't a big problem, but the coalition said that Gears 5 was not going to be the middle game in a new trilogy. In fact, it sounded more like they had an enormous plan for an expansive arc because they wanted character development to be a slow burn and have them not be stereotypes, which, by the way, they failed at given how Del, Faz, Kate, and even JD were all stereotypes. And let's not even get into the claim of their story being intentionally written to have loose ends, which they called negative spaces that would not be explained whatsoever. As in, not even in the sequel. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds like they realized they have plot holes and tried to do the broken window band-aid meme, with the band-aid being negative spaces. But in all honesty, it wasn't all that bad either, despite what my previous tirade would have you believe. For one, the theme of repeating the mistakes of the past was an interesting, well-executed concept that showed the hubris of a cast that didn't know the horrors of all-out war and weren't learning from the history. Or, at the very least, were taking the wrong lessons from history. And while I feel like this should have been explored a bit more, I was fine with how this theme was handled and persisted throughout the entire game. What with the relaunching of WMDs, the authoritarian way the COG was dealing with dissent and not taking genuine threats seriously. Hell, the varied biomes of the open world do look striking, even if they are just mostly empty plains. The Hivebusters DLC does an especially amazing job at this. Jack's upgrades do allow for some genuinely fun combat adaptation, such as using the shock trap to dispatch Juvies via a choke point so it can focus on other enemies. The narrative not simply discarding the old cast, but rather placing them all in important positions in the story, makes them all still feel respected in a way that makes sense in the story. Even contributing to the earlier mentioned theme of repeating past mistakes, which they constantly warn you about. And the city sections, alongside Azura, are genuinely amazing chapters, with the Invasion of Settlement 2 being one of my favorite sections in the entire game by far, in part because of the destruction that the Swarm causes alongside the Hammer of Dawn. Fun fact, according to Rod Ferguson, the Hammer of Dawn reactivating and widespread destruction are always signs of the game and the story launching into a full-blown war for the foreseeable future. This is apparently such a popular idea within the team that they constantly brainstorm ideas to destroy the planet in more creative ways, and it became a recurring concern how they could justify more environmental destruction in a way that fits the narrative. It is silly stuff like this that you can actually tangibly feel in the game, as the sections with widespread destruction are usually some of the most fun and memorable parts. That was also in part because of how genuinely amazing Gears 5 looks. The jump in graphics between Gears 4 and 5 is insane, and to this day looks better than most games that released after it. Like, have you seen the lighting in this game? It feels like a shame that most of the time you focus more on killing the enemies because of how amazing everything looks. Some horror games should take notes from that intro section because holy fuck, that dark corridor is... God, I cannot even put it into words. With Gears 4, Xbox wanted to use it to show off how good graphics could get on the Xbox. And in my opinion, in comparison to this, which also was meant to show off the graphical might of the Xbox, yeah, it isn't even close. Art director Colin Penty claimed that this was achieved by investing a lot into CPU bottleneck optimization and making use of every single post-processing effect possible in UE4. As I don't want to spend yet another 3 months on a single video and have YouTube punish me for trying to make a well-edited video again, you can find the details of the optimization now on screen, as well as the myriad of technical changes, which you can find linked in the description. And speaking of technical changes, see those health bars above their heads? Why are they there? They don't add anything to the gameplay and look weird in an otherwise very clean HUD. My guess is that they were added because all live service games had them back then, and no further thought was given to it because there's no reason to have it. I can't help but wonder if this was something that came about before or after those internal playtests held 2 years before launch. The ones where they focused on finding bugs and tightening up the story. Tightening up the story? The story was once even more of a mess than this? What the fuck? Aside from that genuinely unbelievable claim, the playtests were also used to refine the encounters, which were mainly upped in difficulty across the board, with each encounter sitting in that sweet spot between easy and overwhelming. This rebalancing was meant to push players out of their comfort zones and allow them to feel accomplished after beating them, even if it took a few deaths. To alleviate the rise in difficulty, which was achieved by making the enemy AI smarter, allowing them to pull off flanking maneuvers or suppressing you while their shotgun buddies just blasted you into oblivion, the team wanted Jack to give options to the player to disrupt enemy strategies with his special abilities. Oh, they also apparently retuned the feel of every gun, which was meant to make the PvP feel more responsive. This reminds me, I have yet to talk about PvP in this video. PvP still is a thing. Alright, that concludes the PvP section of this video. Let's get to talking about how the game was received, which I don't think I really need to make a huge secret. This game was torn to shreds by non-critics. But before getting to the ass blasting, let's actually look at what people did like about it. As mentioned in the intro, Gears 5 was one of the best-selling games for Xbox since Halo 4. The set pieces helped the game stand out amongst its peers, even if it was only by so much. It looked amazing and had accessibility in mind during every step of the development process, even going so far as to have entire development phases dedicated to ensuring that the game would release with as many accessibility options as possible. And finally, the vast representation of different cultures on Serra not only added a lot of depth to the world itself, but was also lauded as something that allowed people in real life to identify with the characters, and the newly added escape mode was also a ton of hectic fun, being helped by the large player pool thanks to Gears 5 having been a day 1 Game Pass release. Sadly, this already concludes the praise that the game got. As spread throughout the first half of this video, the story felt not well thought out despite it being fun to play. Plot points were dropped, set up, and ended in such a rapid pace that nothing really felt satisfactory, which bafflingly was a goal for the team, as they wanted every major event in this game to only be a setup for future games, entirely ignoring the fact that the story of this game had to also have some conclusions. The live service nature of Gears 5 and the need to make money for each Game Pass player that didn't fully buy the game led to it being genuinely over-monetized, with some community-made graphics adding up the total cost of every microtransaction to around 750 didgeridoos. Skins, for example, were sold for about 10 euros each. Sure, they could also be earned, but players complained that their earn rate for iron, which was the in-game currency, was abysmally slow. Yet other players pointed out that due to the heavy monetization present in the game, they got less content for the same amount of money as previous games, which Rod Ferguson rejected, stating that there was more content there, they just had to play the daily and weekly objectives to get them. This obviously didn't sit well with the community, as they didn't want to be told which game mode to play, and beyond that, heavily disliked the time-limited battle passes that were clearly meant to drive player retention through FOMO. This funneling of players into specific modes made them even more annoyed due to the game launching in a genuinely unplayable state with infinite load screens, prompts to interact with things not appearing, and constant disconnects even in the campaign, which, remember, was also always online. But the worst part was that not only was the team incredibly slow to respond to complaints, but they also seemed completely disconnected from what the community wanted, rolling out tone-deaf collaborations like the Terminator crossover and promoting the game with creators like Ninja instead of long-standing Gears creators. It really felt like they didn't understand what the fanbase was looking for in the Gears game. I usually don't like to end videos on such negative notes, but this game genuinely made it hard not to be negative. While the previous games were all fun in a way that always pushed the negatives to the side, this time, despite the game being a ton of fun, it simply feels too mired in its problems to just look past them. Gears 5 reminds me a lot of the dumpster fire that was The Last Jedi to Gears of War 4's The Force Awakens. I am, however, hopeful that the team has taken all the feedback they have gotten and will use it to make Gears of War E-Day the best it can possibly be.